I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that
What about the Shuttle incident?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
we left.
more of a community.
Before China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Among his many achievements, he was a decorated fighter pilot in Vietnam, an aerospace engineer, and a corporate leader. But above all, Guy Bluford is best known as the first African-American to fly in space. His first of 4 missions was aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983. A 1964 graduate of Penn State, he was inducted into both the International Space Hall of Fame and the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame, and in 2011 was awarded the Pennsylvania Society's Gold Medal for Distinguished Achievement. We'll talk with him about his career, about his experiences in space, and about the future of space exploration. Here's our conversation with Guy Bluford. Guy Bluford, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here. My pleasure.
You were part of NASA's barrier-breaking 1978 class of astronauts. 8,000 people applied for the job. There were 200 finalists. 35 people were selected. 3 of them were African-American men, 6 women. Tell us, including, I should say, Sally Ride.
Right, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about landing this dream job. This job, it sounds like you dreamed about since childhood.
Well, I haven't dreamed about it since childhood because astronauts didn't exist when I was a kid. But no, I applied for the astronaut program. I knew there were 8,000 or so who applied. I said, well, you know, I was curious as to if they'd really select me. Wow, they selected me. And so I was excited about it. And for me, it was a transition for me because I had worked in the airplane business in the Air Force for 13 years and developed that technology and that understanding of that stuff. And then I was making the transition to space. So it was a learning experience for me, working with NASA and the space business, and meeting some great people and working for some great teams. So it was a great experience.
In fact, you were a fighter pilot. You flew 144 missions in Vietnam, 65 of them over North Vietnam.
Right.
And looking at astronauts over time, it looks like your career path from being a fighter pilot to even your degree in aerospace engineering looks sort of typical.
Well, I don't know if it's typical or not, but
I'm thinking John Glenn.
Yeah, but I think also it was ideal at the time that I was selected because they were still developing the shuttle. They needed people to help develop the shuttle because the shuttle hadn't flown. And so they were bringing in a crew of people that would help them develop the shuttle and actually fly on the shuttle when it began to fly. So you needed people who were comfortable with flying, who had engineering backgrounds, and I specifically had a background in aerospace engineering. So I proved to be an optimum candidate when it came time to be selected. So it was very nice for me.
You will be known forever in history as the first African-American astronaut.
Sure.
And I'm wondering what impact that had on you. And I'm going to back up for a moment because Sally Ride, who we mentioned just a moment ago, was the first American woman. And as a result, there was a lot of extra media attention on her. She got questions from the media such as, will this have an impact on your reproductive organs?
Yeah.
And do you weep when things go wrong? What was it like for you?
Well, I saw the same sort of stuff, but not to the same degree as Sally. And I was very fortunate because Sally flew on STS-7 and I flew on STS-8. So I flew right behind Sally. So I was down there as part of the launch for STS-7, so I saw her launch and I saw her come back, and then I saw all the media attention and I recognized that I was going to get the same thing. So I used Sally as a way of learning how to deal with the media. And so I was sort of in her wake to some extent because though Sally still had all this stuff going on, it was reduced in my case, but there was still some in my case. But no, I was surprised to see it. I treated it as a way of thanking people for giving me the opportunity to fly in space. Wonderful experience, but also I used it as an opportunity to thank people who laid the foundation for me to fly in space, i.e. Tuskegee Airmen and so forth, but also teachers and parents and mentors. So I used it as a way of thanking people.
You entered the program in 1978, and you were known as ASCANs, astronaut candidates. It wasn't until 1983, 5 years later, that you actually flew in STS-8 in the Challenger. Give us a kind of a thumbnail, a brief description of the training that went on in those 5 years.
Well, interesting enough. So we came in 78, and the plan was we would train you for 2 years. You know, they anticipate training for 2 years. So we got a lot of academic training in physiology, materials processing, geography. We had people come in and talk about it. We had a lot of training in shuttle systems, and we really didn't have a formal training system. So when the people talked about shuttle systems, they pulled in engineers who pulled in, you know, put in view graphs and all that sort of stuff to talk about shuttle systems. And then they had some preliminary trainers, single system trainers, where you can train on various systems, hydraulic, electrical, that sort of thing. And then they had a couple of full-up trainers which had all the systems that you can practice on. But we were pretty down, we were low in the totem pole coming in because there were 28 other astronauts who were in the program who were ahead of us. But it was pretty busy, you know, lots to learn. And what happened was 2 years, they came to the conclusion that they only needed a year. So at the end of the year, they said, you are trained. And at that point,
you got your silver pin.
We got our silver pin. And at that point, then they used us to help support some of the early missions. So I ended up supporting the early missions like everybody else as we got ready to fly the shuttle for the first time in '81. So it was an interesting period.
Part of this training was a lot of simulations. So you would think that you would go to space with some idea of how physically you would feel. At the same time, there are people who go on cruises, for example, and don't realize till they're in the middle of the cruise that they get seasick.
Yeah.
You were one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
You didn't get what's called space adaptation syndrome, but
right.
2 of the 5 crew members actually did. Explain what it was like physically to be in space, and bearing in mind that at liftoff, you are going into orbit upside down.
You're going in the orbit upside down. So you go out to this vehicle, you lie on your back. You're on your back with your feet up because the vehicle goes this way. On liftoff, the vehicle, you're on the solid rocket boosters, so there's a lot of noise and rumble as you rocket up on the solid rocket boosters. You rocket up on them for 2 minutes. You go from 0 velocity to 3 times the speed of sound in 2 minutes, okay? And at about 120,000 feet, the solid rocket boosters fall away. At that point, it's a very quiet ride, a very smooth ride, and you go from 3 times the speed of sound to 25 times the speed of sound in 6.5 minutes. And you're sort of thrown, you're sort of pushed in the back of your seat as this thing accelerates out, and you're upside down. You know, as this thing accelerates out to 18,000 miles an hour. So it's a great ride. And then at 18,000 miles an hour, the main engine shut down. You're sort of thrown forward just a little bit. And then things start floating around and you realize that you're sort of in space, so to speak. It's a great experience.
There was a cockpit recording. And at liftoff, when you played it back, you heard a lot of laughing and giggling. And I think your whole crew was thinking, who is that? Who is that? Only for you to discover that that was your reaction.
Yeah, I don't know if there was a lot of laughing and giggling because I was the flight engineer, so I sat between the pilot and the commander. But I realized when we were rocketing up, there was somebody in the background giggling, and I recognized how much I enjoyed the ride. You know, I mean, it was sort of unconscious, but you know, I had trained so hard. I'd spent 18 months training, and then you actually get to fly it. And I sort of equivocated to driving your parents give you the keys to the car for the first time, and you go drive it for the first time, you know. So it was a
times 100 at least.
so it was a pleasant experience, and then it was very pleasant to get on orbit.
I read one astronaut story, and he talked about, Steve Lindsay was his name, and he talked about this feeling of butterflies in the stomach the entire time. You didn't experience that.
No, and I was excited about flying. I think all of us were. This was the 8th flight of the shuttle, so we talked to the old astronauts, and they told us what it's like, and you see all these films. So you're excited about going out and just flying, you know, so it was a nice experience.
I know that from outer space, India looks hazy, Australia looks kind of red, but you have traveled 2 million miles in outer space at 180,000 miles per hour orbiting the Earth. And I'm wondering what your perspective is when you look from that distance and all those miles, when you look at Earth. What do you make of it?
Well, interesting enough, I tell people that we go around the Earth every 90 minutes. Every 90 minutes you go around the Earth. So you're on the light side of the Earth, the sun shining side of the Earth for 45 minutes, and then on the dark side of the Earth. And when you look down at the Earth, you can see land masses, and it looks like a National Geographic map, but you don't see borders. So you recognize that this is a very small planet, and we all have to live on it together. We all have to take care of it together. We all have to manage the resources together. So that was the perspective that I got. You know, you take a look at the burning of the forest in the Amazon and some of the pollution here and there, and you recognize that we all share this one planet together, and we all have to get along together and share the resources we have on this planet.
My guess is that it looks small and fragile from that distance, sort of what you're describing there.
Yeah, I would say that, but I also would say that it's home, and it's someplace that we all have to share together and get along together with and manage our resources so that we all prosper on it.
The Challenger accident, the tragedy, and when we talk about the Challenger, it's really one of NASA's greatest triumphs. It had so many successful missions, but it was also NASA's greatest tragedy. On its 10th launch, you were its 8th, on its 10th launch on January 28, 1986, it exploded 73 seconds after liftoff with 7 crew members aboard, 4 of whom were in your ASCAN class. They were your classmates.
They were my classmates. And interesting enough, that was, that launch slot was our launch slot. So strangely enough, my crew was supposed to launch at that time, and we flipped with 51L because our payload, which was a laboratory, was ready and so forth. So we launched in October, and then they launched in our slot in January. So I was well aware of that. We did lose 4 crew members on it from our class. And at that point, my thinking was that I wanted to stay in the program long enough to straighten that out, to make sure that we got the vehicle flying again and so forth and so on. Because there were astronauts who sort of left the program
after that accident.
And after the accident. But my thinking was that though I had flown twice, I thought it was important not only to NASA for me to help them get the vehicle flying again, but also it was important because some of those people that are on the vehicle I knew. So
Rob McNair, one of the 3 African Americans who was inducted when you were
Ron McNair, Judy Resnick, I knew both of them relatively well. Dick Scobie, Ella Anazuka were all classmates, so I knew them all.
You actually were involved in the investigation following that accident. And what it came down to, you said, was faulty management decisions. And that made me think of the oil spill in the Gulf Coast, where management knew that there were some things that weren't quite right. And in fact, with the Challenger, they knew that some O-rings weren't quite right as far back as 1977.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what had happened was they knew that there was a discrepancy. They had gotten away with the discrepancy. It hadn't bought them. It hadn't bothered them. They thought that maybe we could fly it with this discrepancy, and the discrepancy up and bit them. It was.
And they're magnified. Little problems are magnified in such intense circumstances.
And you got to realize that when you're flying in space, a little thing can get you into big problems. So you really have to be very diligent. And unfortunately, these guys weren't, and it really came up to bite them. So we had problems with the O-rings. There were minor problems. People saw the problems. They didn't worry about it. They recognized the problems were deficiencies, but they saw it's called normalization of deviation. They got used to it, and then it jumped up and bit them. It was almost like Russian roulette, where you spin and the gun never went off, and all of a sudden it goes off. So it was sort of like that.
How did the space shuttle system and program change after that accident? And were you afraid to go up after that?
No.
You did 2 other missions.
No, I wasn't afraid to go up after it, but the organization changed. All of a sudden, astronauts needed to be in the management chain because the organization, NASA, was run primarily by engineers, and you needed operators in that system to work with the engineers to remind them that people are flying and there is a safety issue involved. You got to maintain this vehicle, all that sort of stuff. So you got more astronauts into the management chain, both in Washington, D.C. and the Johnson Space Center, to emphasize the importance of safety and operational readiness and all that sort of stuff into the process. And I think that worked for a very long period of time, and we went for a long time before we had another problem.
The space shuttle was retired in July 2011. That's about 9 years earlier than most people expected. I thought we figured that the space shuttle system would work until about 2020.
Well, I hadn't heard that, but you got to realize the space shuttle had been flying since '81. So we've got almost 30 years of flying out of the machine. And it's an old machine, it's an old machine. And so it was time for it to retire. And then the decision that was made was the purpose of the shuttle was to build the International Space Station. So let's fly it until we get the International Space Station completed, and then we can retire the shuttle, which is basically what they did. But the shuttle is 30 years old, and it was due for a new vehicle, and hopefully NASA will develop a new vehicle in the near future. But I think when it was retired, it had done its job, and that was to build the International Space Station.
And of course, the International Space Station is run really by 16 nations, most importantly the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan.
Sure.
But for years, the shuttle system was providing supplies, transportation of supplies, as well as crew members to the International Space Station. And I think a lot of people wonder, can the United States retain its leadership role in space without a shuttle system?
Well, it's going to eventually develop a replacement for the shuttle system. They're developing a rocket now, SLS, and an Orion, a capsule that will take astronauts back into space, but also deep space. But also NASA is relying on the commercial guys to come in and provide the transportation from Earth to the International Space Station. And right now we've got SpaceX doing that. Hopefully Orbital Sciences will do that. So we have a couple of areas where we will probably start providing stuff to the International Space Station. But as of right now, crews are getting up and down on the International Space Station on the Russian Soyuz. Okay, the Russians are also providing supplies to the International Space Station. So they have a rocket that they take to the International Space Station. The Europeans do it with the with their Ariane, and the Japanese can do it. So we have 3 other choices, but right now we are developing that capability, but we're doing it through commercial means.
And cooperatively rather than competitively. But I wonder, with, as you said, right now, the Russian Soyuz being so important to the maintenance of the International Space Station, what impact political issues like what we're seeing now with Russia and the situation in Syria, what, if any, impact does it have on international cooperation in space, or is space exploration like sports where we transcend that in cases like this?
I'm hoping that we transcend that. You know, I have not heard any rumbles one way or the other. Right now you have 6 crew members on the International Space Station. Half of those crew members are Russian. So, and the crews are up there for almost 6 months at a time. So you have 12 crews up there over a year span, and half of them are Russian, 40% are American, and then you've got Canadian and a Japanese and a European. So I think because the Russians provide most of the crews as well as the support for the International Space Station, I think hopefully that will transcend the problems here on Earth.
You spent a lot of time in the astronaut office through NASA, and I'm wondering what it was like for you to interact with astronauts from all over the world.
It was great. It was a great experience, but it was great just to deal with the American astronauts as well as some of the European, but I didn't see a lot of them. I saw the European astronauts on my second space flight because I flew with 3 of them, which were top-notch guys, and we also interfaced with their Mission Control Center in Oberpfaffenhofen. So it was great to work with international astronauts. On my second space flight, I had to learn to speak German, which was interesting. You know, I had to learn to speak German, and I spent I'd say 4 to 5 months in Germany training 3 and 4 weeks at a time, and it gave me an opportunity to practice my German. So it was an interesting experience from that regard.
You know, what's really interesting to me is here, I should say that you come from a pretty distinguished family. Your father was a mechanical engineer.
Sure.
Your mother was a special education teacher, and you were one of 3 boys. But your guidance counselor didn't even think you were college material.
Sure.
So you go off to college, you do well, you get a degree in aerospace engineering, you eventually get a Ph.D., and after your career as an astronaut, you get an M.B.A. And I wonder sometimes if you pinch yourself at the life you've led and the adventures you've been on.
I've been very fortunate. I feel very fortunate in the sense that as a kid, I sort of knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in the aerospace business of some sort.
Was it because of the Tuskegee?
No,
okay.
no. I wanted to work in the aerospace business of some sort. I had a father who was an engineer. I wanted to be an engineer. My heroes growing up were engineers, the people who, Jack Northrop, the people who worked the skunk works at Lockheed Martin. So I wanted to be an engineer, and that's why I came to Penn State. Penn State was one of the few colleges that had aeronautical engineering, and it was a state university, so I came to Penn State. So for me, a big break was to graduate from high school and come to Penn State. That was a key thing. And though we had this college counselor who waved me off, I think the college counselor provided doubt in my mind, you may not be able to get into college. It forced me to apply to colleges that I really wasn't interested in. But I still remember receiving the letter from Penn State saying that you had been accepted to Penn State and you'd been accepted to the aerospace, at that time, aeronautical engineering program at Penn State, and that was right on.
What was it like in 1960 to be an African-American in the engineering program?
Well, I was by myself, so to speak, but that didn't bother me at all. I was just excited to get to Penn State. And it was exciting 4 years at Penn State. You know, I tell people all the time that Penn State proved to be the launch pad for a very exciting career. Because I came to Penn State with the goal of get my degree in aerospace engineering and I'll roar out and work in industry, Boeing, McDonnell, Douglas, and all that sort of stuff. That was my goal. And then I showed up at Penn State, and the first thing I discovered was we had mandatory ROTC. So I had to select an ROTC program, which was Air Force. And then I decided to go Advanced Air Force. Because of the draft and an opportunity to serve my country. And so my career started in the Air Force. But no, it was, when I look at Penn State, I'll say I got a degree in aerospace engineering. I got my private pilot's license up here as part of the ROTC program. I got my commission in the Air Force, and I met this woman who in my freshman year, and married
It's still
her.
next to you, still by your side.
Married her in my senior year, and all four of those experiences were dynamite.
And you retired as a colonel.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious to know, because there are critics who say we can't afford space exploration, it's time to focus on other things. Why is it worth it?
Well, I mean, all the things that we've learned from space, the technology development in order to get there is really beneficial, and it spreads out in our society in lots of different ways. And I think even if nothing else, that is the big reason for going. I mean, as humans, we have this desire to explore. I think we need to continue that. We've got to decide how much resources we need to do that, but I think that's critical, And then as we explore, we learn more and more and develop more and more widgets and gadgets and improve the quality of our life, all that. That's why we do that. So.
All right, Guy Bluford, thank you so much for talking with us.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Guy Bluford. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find more video from this interview. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you.
This has been a production of WPSU.